Now, with the housekeeping aside, it gives me a great pleasure to introduce the webinar for this evening. 23 years ago, Hope Farm was purchased by the RSPB to show that wildlife and a profitable farm business can thrive together. Declines in nature on farmland have gone back over half a century, with insect decline, farmland bird decline, and many species that are reliant on farmland habitats to thrive struggling to do so. Whilst biodiversity has perhaps not been given enough value in policy to prevent species at risk of extinction, it has also not given biodiversity enough value to maintain stable ecosystems. Unfortunately for farming, it's this lack of stability that can give rise to issues with pests, increase susceptibility to disease, and reduce soil health, which underpins crop health and resilience and stable yields. Whilst Hope Farm started with the aims to show how wildlife and profitable farming can go hand in hand, there is a growing movement with a building evidence base that demonstrates nature is not just commensal but symbiotic to crop health and sustainable food. Where we started at Hope Farm to build habitats for the good of nature, taking out areas that are less favourable to crop production, we now look at how we can manipulate the habitat provision within and around crop edges to look after a sustainable system for the overall benefit of the farm business. It's a rocky road with this transition. I don't want anyone to think that our efforts are perfect solutions, far from it. But that's why it's essential that we try to improve our knowledge of natural systems within our farm, to improve the function by working with nature rather than against it. So with that, I'm so excited to introduce 3 speakers who will share knowledge on hedgerows, how to manage them for the benefit of nature and the farm system, carabid beetles, and how some of the latest research on how we can improve the ecosystem services for from these species. We will then hear from a farmer who has focused on the soil's biological function to improve crop husbandry and ultimately the farm business. So our first speaker this evening is Sarah Barnsley. Sarah is a hedgerow officer for a conservation organisation, People's Trust for Endangered Species. Her work puts the spotlight on hedgerows, highlighting their importance as a habitat for wildlife and the benefits that they provide for people. Working with farming groups, wildlife groups and the general public, Sarah raises awareness for how to manage this valuable habitat for wildlife and for keeping hedgerows healthy for the long term in the future. Over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Georgina. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that okay, but please shout if not. Okay, so yes, as Georgina said, my name is Sarah Barnsley. I'm Hedgerow Officer with People's Trust for Endangered Species. I'm excited to be here talking to you tonight, so thank you for the opportunity, Georgina and Sophie. And yes, today we're going to talk all about hedges, why they're great for people, for wildlife, and a bit about their management as well. So hedges are great for wildlife because they provide 3 key components. So the first of these is a physical home. Many species across many different taxonomic groups are using hedgerows as either overwintering or nesting sites. So nesting birds, hibernating hedgehogs, dormice and other small mammals, and some insect species as well. So some of our bumblebees, for example, will nest in the clumps of tusky grass that are found at the base of a hedge, and then deadwood-dependent insects can live in the deadwood found at the centre of old hedgerow trees. A second key component that hedgerows provide is a complementary habitat. So even if some of our wildlife aren't directly living in the hedge network, they might still be using it for other important resources, whether that's food or shelter, or sometimes for other important behaviours as well. So some songbirds, for example, will sing from the tops of hedge trees in the spring, and then winter visitors like fieldfares and redwings will enjoy the bountiful berry supply that's provided by a healthy hedge. And finally, hedgerows are the countryside highways for wildlife. So they allow bats, butterflies and moths to navigate around the countryside. And they allow other species like dormice to move between remnant habitat patches, so connecting up populations that would otherwise be isolated from one another. And dormice are actually a really great example of a species that uses hedgerows for all three of these components. Hedgerows have been shown to support breeding populations of dormice, which means that they are using them as a home. Dormice also feed in hedgerows, and actually the dormouse diet changes throughout the year. They're known as successional feeders, so they need a really species-rich hedgerow to meet all of their food requirements. So they start by eating the flowers of species like hawthorn and oak in the spring, and they then move on to later flowering species like bramble and honeysuckle in the summer. And then in the late summer, early autumn, they switch to feeding on nuts and berries as these ripen and become available. And finally, dormice are arboreal creatures. This means they prefer to travel across branches and across the ground, and a healthy hedge network allows them to do this, to safely navigate around the countryside. And the value of hedges to wildlife is summed up really nicely by this Life in a Hedge study, which was carried out by Robert Walton from the Devon Hedge Group, and which is now published in British Wildlife. And Rob counted an incredible 2,070 species in just one 85-metre stretch of hedgerow in Devon. But as hedges are a man-made habitat, it can be surprising that they're so rich and abundant in wildlife. But although they aren't officially a natural habitat, they are known as an ecotone, where two or more different habitat types overlap. And in the case of hedges, their structure mimics the rich habitat mosaic that's found at the edge of a woodland. So like that you can see in the photo here. The habitat types represented in the hedge network then are woodland through the tree component, flowering scrub, and then grassland or pasture, which is represented by having a well-managed margin adjacent to a hedge. And of course, none of these habitat types are recreated fully in the hedge network, but they are able to support many species from each, like 80% of our woodland birds, for example. So hedges are clearly great for wildlife, but they're great for people as well, and their importance is being increasingly recognised, whether that's providing shelter or shade for livestock, or whether it's protecting crops from the effects of high and cold winds, things like crop lodging and chilling injuries. Hedges are also really great at preventing soil erosion, both because they reduce those surface wind speeds, but also because they act as a barrier against waterborne runoff. And actually there's growing evidence that hedges are really great at soaking up water, so they could play a really important role in terms of flood management. A recent study that came out by Holden and colleagues in 2019, and which was carried out in North Yorkshire, found that hedgerow soils were significantly drier than both arable or pasture soils. And the same study also found that during a storm event, the hedgerow soils took a lot longer to become saturated with water, and they were able to hold a lot more water before saturation as well. Carbon is a really topical subject at the moment, and we don't yet have all of the answers as to how hedgerows store carbon at different stages of their life cycle and under different management routines. But we do know that they can store carbon in a number of ways, in their hedge trees, in the above and the below ground biomass, the shrub and the root layer, and over time, hedgerows accumulate soil organic carbon in the soils below and around them. Another recent study that came out by Drexler and colleagues in 2021, and which analysed data across multiple studies, actually found that soil organic carbon stocks were 32% higher in soils underneath the hedgerows than in soils from the adjacent cropland. So hedges are clearly great for both wildlife, for people as well, but sadly we've lost more than 50% of hedges since the 1950s. Of those that remain, some are clearly in better condition than others. And this hedgerow loss was predominantly a result of the incentivization of hedgerow removal after the Second World War, because there was a need to increase agricultural food production at that time, and this led to drove the intensification of agriculture. But thankfully, hedgerow removal is far less common these days, and lines of newly planted hedgerow trees are a really common sight, and that's really wonderful to see. But we need to remember that lines of newly planted hedgerow trees don't adequately replace the value of old, especially species-rich hedges, at least certainly not for a very long time, and with appropriate management. So given the historic hedgerow loss, it's more important than ever that we keep our remaining hedges in good health. And we're still at risk of losing hedges, but this is for a different reason. It's due to, it's linked to management. So some hedges are lost through overmanagement, as we can see in the photo here, where they're cut too regularly, too much, often to the same height. This causes stem health to deteriorate over time. And so as we can see in the photo here, we can sometimes lose them in this way. But other hedges can be lost through undermanagement. If we don't manage our hedges, they eventually turn into a line of trees. This sounds like it should be a good thing, but as all of those plants compete for light and race upwards, as they do so, they lose a lot of that density of vegetation at the base of the hedge, which is so important as shelter for mammals, for reptiles, for birds again. So we do need to manage hedges, but we need to do this sensitively and in a way which is optimal for both wildlife and for maintaining hedgerow health into the long term. So how then should we manage them? Well, actually, when it comes to our young or our recently planted or recently rejuvenated hedges, regular light trimming on a yearly basis can be a good thing. And that's because for most of our broadleaf plant species, that regular light trimming on a yearly basis encourages the plant to put more effort into the lateral branching growth. It changes the hormonal balance of the plant. So if we then cut slightly higher and wider each time we cut the hedge, we end up with that really lovely dense shrub structure that's so great for wildlife. But what about our established hedges? Well, most of our broadleaf plant species also only flower and fruit on second year wood. So once we've already got a really good, healthy, dense hedge structure, we don't want to cut our hedges on a yearly basis, because if we do, we'll remove a lot of that flowering and fruiting potential. So a better option instead is to cut our hedges on a 2 or preferably a 3-year rotation. And as well as avoiding trimming our hedges too regularly, we also want to avoid cutting our hedges to the same height. So over trimming reduces the wildlife value of a hedge, but it also threatens the structure of a hedge itself. So with over trimming, at first we start to lose some of the density of vegetation, leafy vegetation at the base of the hedge, and then we start to lose some of the main woody stems along the length of the hedge. And initially the remaining hedge plants will stretch to fill those gaps, and we don't always realise that those gaps are forming in the canopy in the first place. But as more and more of the woody stems are lost, this becomes harder to do, as we have larger and larger gaps forming over time, and we start to erode away the connectivity of that hedge for wildlife. And so if over-management continues, sometimes we can lose a hedge altogether in this way. And this might be happening over 20, 40 years or so, and we don't realise until it's too late. But thankfully, we can avoid these gaps, and we can avoid them by cutting gradually higher and wider. So about 10 centimetres higher and wider than the previous trim line. And this helps to protect the structure of the hedge, but it also maintains a strip of new wood around the edge of the hedge, which still flowers and fruits even on years that the hedge has been cut. And we often get asked at this point, doesn't the hedge then grow unmanageably big? But actually, if you're cutting your hedge once every 3 years on rotation, and you're only cutting 10 centimetres higher each time, it would take 30 years before your hedge grew a metre taller. So you're not necessarily talking about really drastic changes in size, but just a slightly more sensitive management approach. And the results speak for themselves. So this is actually a hedge which is cut on a yearly basis, but it's cut gradually higher and wider each time. And you can see that it's got really abundant flowers and really abundant fruit later in the year. And finally, no matter how well we manage our hedges, they will at some point need rejuvenation through either laying or coppicing. So this thickens the hedge back up from the base, and it resets the cycle all over again. And so from here, we start the process of management all over again. And whether we choose hedge laying, as you can see in the photo here, or coppicing, the low cut on the main woody stems encourages new growth from the ground upwards. And if we didn't lay or coppice our hedges, we would eventually lose them, either through them turning into a line of trees or through the formation of gaps over time. So all of this hedgerow management advice can be summed up in the hedgerow management life cycle, which you can see in the diagram here, and which was developed based on work by Nigel Adams from the National Hedge Laying Society and our partners at HedgeLink. And at the centre of the diagram here, you can see the healthy hedge life cycle, where all of the hedgerow structural stages are dense and healthy and well managed. So appropriate management for hedges in this healthy hedge life cycle are the cutting gradually higher and wider that I mentioned earlier, and then the cutting on a 2 or preferably a 3-year rotation. And then if we've got the space to do so, we can enter the hedge into a period of non-intervention where we don't cut it for a number of years or so. We allow it to really grow out into a big hedge providing lots of resources until it starts to lose some of that density of vegetation at the base. And at that point, we can then rejuvenate it through coppicing or laying to keep it in that healthy hedge cycle. But the great thing about this diagram is it shows us that no matter the condition of our hedge, we can bring it back to that healthy hedge cycle in the centre. Whether we've got a tall and overgrown hedge that's growing upwards and turning gradually into a line of trees, or whether we've got an over-trimmed hedge which is losing stem density, we can rejuvenate a hedge, plant up the gaps at the same time to bring it back to that healthy hedge cycle. So I'll just quickly introduce our Healthy Hedgerows survey. So this survey was developed by People's Trust for Endangered Species. The aim is to provide a health checking tool for farmers, land managers, anyone who's directly involved with hedgerow management on the ground. It asks 6 questions and it takes about 2 minutes to complete per hedge. And it can be completed either through the People's Trust for Endangered Species Hedgerow Survey website or through our Healthy Hedgerows app, which can be downloaded through Google Play or the App Store. And it's best done in the winter when hedges don't have any leaves on them, as it's easier to see the underlying structural condition of a hedge. And the Healthy Hedgerows survey was developed through the Close the Gap project, which was a government-funded project led by the Tree Council, and we were a partner on the project. So it asks 6 simple questions linked, for example, to the position of the hedge within the healthy hedge life cycle that we've just looked at, and which was developed, which was based on the 10 hedgerow structural condition scores by Nigel Adams. It asks other questions like the width of the hedge, the height of the hedge, and so on. And when the data is added to either the app or to the PTES Hedgerow Survey website, bespoke management advice is generated for each hedge surveyed, based on the life cycle that we've looked at today and the optimal hedge structure for wildlife. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll pass back to Georgina now. Just stop sharing my screen.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Sarah. That was really interesting, just seeing all those pictures of those hedgerows that are delivering so many benefits. And we've used that hedge link diagram to help inform our management at Hope Farm as well. So it's a really good way of helping to decide what's best to do for the longevity of the hedge.
Brilliant.
And I think we need to go out and fill out that survey on a few of our hedgerows as well. So without further ado, I'm now going to introduce Kelly. Jowett is an entomologist working on the design of cropping systems and landscapes to reconcile crop and livestock production with biodiversity and ecosystem services. She has a particular interest in the functional biodiversity of carabid and dung beetles, and is working with farmers to apply her research. She completed her PhD on modelling of carabid beetle distributions in farm landscapes towards effective natural enemy pest control, has an MRes in global food security and development, and a bachelor's degree in environmental conservation. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from you, Kelly, and all that you can educate us on beetles on farmland. Over to you.
Thank you. So, see if I can share my screen. Right, you can see that okay?
Yeah, that's all good.
Brilliant. So, hello everyone. I'm Kelly and this is Megan, who's co-piloting today, being an ambassador for carabid beetles everywhere. So Megan is a Nigerian carabid beetle who comes with me to all my events to show just how beautiful carabid beetles are. So why are we interested in carabid beetles? If I can get to my next slide. So in farmland, so there's 40,000 species of carabids worldwide. They occur everywhere in all kinds of environments. They're very adaptable to their environments, but particularly in farmland, because it's a disturbed environment, they do very well. And they predate on a number of pest species, pretty much everything that they encounter. They're like the hyenas of the beetle world. They will eat anything. Yeah, I'm looking at you, Megan. But a lot of people don't realise that they also eat weed seeds, because if you think of a weed seed, it is a seed, it is a package of resources for the growing plant. So that's a nice fatty food resource for the beetles to eat. And they can eat up to 4,000 weed seeds per metre squared per day. Someone counted that up in a lab somewhere, but that's quite impressive when you think of what they are removing from the seed bank on a kind of daily basis. So that's why I look at them as an agroecologist. And when I'm talking about how to get more beetles on the farms, because obviously we want that to control crop pests, we're thinking about what the beetles need to feed, what they need to breed, and what they need to shelter. Because invertebrates have a lot of different life stages, and of course carabids are no exception. So they have eggs that are laid in the soil. The larvae grow in the soil and feed in the soil, also controlling pests, which is really cool. They pupate there, and then the adults are the ones that we always notice crawling around on the paths. So they need kind of these permanent features in the landscape, such as the hedges and the field margins, to move around. So the corridors that Sarah mentioned, they use those for moving along the landscape. Megan's moving along right now, trying to distract me. But then they move into the crop area to breed and to feed on a daily basis. So that's why we need both kind of permanent features in the landscape to encourage them as a spillover effect, that's what we call it, into crop areas. So we need those kind of source environments so that they can move into fields where we want them. So there we go, got a nice animation there. So the obvious one that they also need is refuge from pesticides. So in the literature, carabid beetles are said to be fairly robust to pesticide use, but that is direct mortality. There are also indirect effects affecting their ability to feed and breed, which takes the populations down. And also when we're thinking about using pesticides, not to be underestimated is that they do carry out biological control on their own. So we don't want to be hitting them if we can help it. So we're thinking about advice to farmers of buffering resource areas. So not spraying close to these kind of source environments, using less toxic and persistent chemicals. So particularly neonics are not great for carabids. And using targeted programs with like threshold levels of pests before you spray. And one big factor in carabids in farm environments is that there are around 30 species. I said there's around 350 species in the UK, but around 30 of those are common in farmland. And all of those species eat slightly different things. They have slightly different kind of preferences. Megan eats snails. By preference, and banana, but you know, not so useful. But there are particular aphid specialists, and some predate on kind of invertebrates in the soil, moreover, some kind of crawl up the stems. So we want a range of species, but there's also this aspect of each species has a certain tolerance. So some can tolerate wet conditions, some can tolerate dry conditions. So overall, there's this message of biodiversity in that for a given environment, as long as you have plenty of species, you're bound to have the predator that can both tolerate those particular environmental variables, but also predate on the crop pests, whatever actually happens in the crop environment, because there's plenty of different types of pests. So as it stands, the Agri-Environment Scheme measures that are said to be useful for carabid beetles are kind of those source environments, those permanent habitats, tussocky grass margins and beetle banks, hedgerows, ponds and ditches, and kind of these more shaded environments are more useful to carabid species that aren't particularly those ones that will be in crop areas, but so there's some carabids that are quite rare, and it's nice to conserve those as well. So it's this aspect of not just that they are useful to us, but they are worth conserving in their own right. So having a range of habitats for all the carabid species is also important. And in a kind of grazing system, having a kind of tussocky grass sward and enabling this by having periods of less grazing or taking entire areas out of management allows for those kind of rest periods and having really nice environments for the carabids overwintering. And also we have to think about this at a farm scale, because carabids will move around the farm migrating, but different species move in different ways. Some will move across the running across the ground. Some species can actually fly really well. Some, I mean, Megan's wings don't work. She won't actually fly at all, but some species fly very well and disperse in that way. So a kind of range of species in that way, thinking about the way that habitats connect over the farm landscape is important too. And at the field scale of thinking about predation, what it is said in the literature is that there's a high activity at the edges of fields near to these source environments. And then that becomes less and less towards field centres. So they move around 50 metres generally into the crop, it's said. So that's the thinking behind beetle banks. I've skipped past that one, sorry. Thinking behind beetle banks is increasing that kind of penetration to the crop centre, meaning that there will be predators in the crop at all times. So I'll take you on a quick whistle-stop tour of my PhD now. So the first piece of research I did, I looked at a study of GM crops. I just took a conventional treatment because we had a big data set of all across the UK, what was happening in field environments and the adjacent habitats across a number of crops. So we've got 4 crops here. And the main thing that's been done in carabid research is looking at carabids as a whole. So just all carabid beetles, what's happening to those? But I've already touched on a lot of this kind of things that different carabids do different things, they can move in different ways in the farm landscape, they eat different things. So it stands to reason that the effects on them in different crops, different kind of habitats will be different. And that bore out in this data set. When I looked at carabid beetles overall, they were most abundant in sugar beet and at the crop centres. But that kind of doesn't account for the variability. So this kind of beige segment here shows that Harpalus rufipes, which is actually a seed-eating carabid, was most abundant in winter oilseed rape near to the edge of fields. So there is a big kind of difference in the species. So that's why my paper is called Species Matters. So looking at it by species specifics is important for understanding what's happening in those ecosystems. So that was my first message. Now, the next thing I was kind of interested in is, so the standard how we catch beetles is we put a cup in the ground, beetle falls into the cup. Yay, lots of beetles to look at. We do have to kill the beetles. That's why there's fluid in the trap. Otherwise, we'd end up with one big fat beetle having eaten all of the others, and it wouldn't tell me very much. But I was interested in the larvae, and the larvae move in the soil, so you can't just catch those with pitfall traps. So I developed these subterranean traps, which haven't been used very much for farm environments or for carabid beetles. And these proved really effective at catching the larvae and finding out what was going on there. So my next piece of work was looking at this in a long-term experiment where we've got a lot of different crop rotations. And the big message here was that there was a lot of difference in the different species and how they experience those crop environments. For instance, not all of the beetles were affected by tillage, whereas the very big beetles did show an effect of tillage on their environments. And the main one that came out of it was that barley undersown with grass had the most abundance of carabid larvae in the subterranean traps. And if I hadn't have used subterranean traps, I would never have found that out, that this crop treatment would have seen, if you was just using pitfall traps, it would have been seen to be deficient in carabid beetles, whereas actually under the ground there was more going on. So that was very interesting to me. The next big piece of work I did was incorporating these subterranean traps along with standard pitfall traps across a number of experimental margins on our farm site at Rothamsted Research. So I had 2 different types of field margins, so a standard kind of grass margin and a wildflower margin, and then just a control where we didn't have any kind of margin, just to make sure that there was kind of no effect to compare with. So I had pitfalls in transect lines along with each other and repetitions so that we know that the data is sound. And the first thing that I found with this is that the adjacent habitat, so where those traps were in the kind of landscape, when it was adjacent to an urban area, so don't get intimidated by my statistical kind of outputs here, but you can see that when those red X's show that that's where it's at the crop center, the things that move in these models are the crop edge positions. So when that's adjacent to an urban area, those green circles have moved downwards. So carabid beetles are less abundant in the crop next to an urban area. And that's because of that lack of spillover from that urban area into the farm environments. So that where in the farm landscape matters. And the next kind of thing here is what we're looking at is the margins. So the blue stars here. The grass margin wasn't actually all that different in my models to having no margin at all. And moreover, when we had a wildflower margin, actually abundances went down in the fields. So it was almost as if these was acting as a barrier, or the carabid beetles really didn't seem to be liking that habitat at all. And I was quite surprised by this. I thought that the wildflower margins might actually be really useful. So that was a really interesting finding. And these likewise are quite weird looking models to someone who doesn't do modeling. But what we're looking at is the spatial interdependence of traps close to each other. So how related two traps are that I had over a farm landscape in space. And when the line levels out, that means that the spatial effect has disappeared. And the different colored lines are different effects that I have accounted for in my models. But what this is showing is that in standard pitfall traps, that 50 meters that I mentioned earlier in the literature as how far carabids move into fields, that would seem to be correct by this, because this is all carabids total abundance. And things move in under the ground in the subterranean pitfalls, no surprise, there wasn't much spatial effect there because things don't move very fast underground, or at least you'd hope not. But when we take this down to species specifics, these running carabids all along the left-hand side here, they were actually moving at greater distances, so 100 meters. So 100 meters was the point at which two traps were related to each other in the species that were occurring. Whereas these species on the right-hand side, those are species that more distribute by flying, and the larvae obviously are underground and don't really move that far. So that was interesting too, that the species specifics alters what is happening in the field environments and how the spatial aspects work. So big messages from these pieces of work, that the main influence on what carabids are occurring where is actually the in-field crop. So a crop diversity will mean there's more diversity of carabid beetles. And the in-field measures may be very important in providing resources for carabids in the center of fields where we want them to persist. So rather than maybe having margins at the edges of fields, more thinking about how we might encourage them into fields by providing those resources actually in the fields. So that's a big thing that I'm going to be working with regenerative farmers over the next year. And thinking about the margin question, when we have margins that are in between fields, maybe not cite them particularly there if they're acting as a barrier, and that may help beetles to move around between fields where we want them to be moving between different crops as different pests occur. Maybe thinking about putting larger margins at the edge of farm landscapes as a buffer to those urban areas perhaps, and in that way we encourage beetles to be in that environment. And what I don't want to say is don't have field margins, because field margins are great for a number of different things. I mean, Sarah touched on that, but a lot of different, particularly predatory invertebrates such as ladybirds, hoverflies, and spiders they all live in margins too. They're important for predation in fields. So I don't want to say don't have margins. Don't take that message from this talk. What it is thinking about where we put those margins to make sure that the predatory invertebrates are getting into the fields where they need to be to provide these services. And maybe thinking about maybe the seed mix that I found wasn't very useful, maybe that wasn't the best seed mix, maybe other seed mixes might be better. So what I am doing, I've done a pilot last autumn with farmers themselves going out and doing trapping in all different kinds of margins and in-field environments to get me a big data set on what is going on. And in that way, I can pick out from, I will get data on a number of different margin types, sizes, where they are in farm landscapes, and I can have a big data set to play with and really pick this apart. But just from the pilot, I'm getting usable information on species. Farmers were becoming really good at identifying carabid species for themselves. That was really cool. But also, I was still seeing that effect that there was less in the margins and more carabids in the center of crops. So that's interesting that it's not just me. Thanks for listening. If there's any farmers out there that want to be involved in the monitoring scheme, I'm rolling that out full scale this year.
Wow, thank you for that, Kelly. Count us in for that, please. I mean, just a few things I took from that. First of all, like the number of weed seeds that they can eat is staggering. There's still that general thing about diversity being a good thing for carabids in general. And in fact, that's great for so many other species as well. So it's, yeah, there's so many interesting messages and things to unpick about different species and how that can help different crops. But I just really look forward to seeing where your research goes next. And I need to have a closer look at those graphs as well. If anyone has any questions coming through, please, that you can think of, please do send them, and we can start to have a look at those to come up with the best answers in the Q&A. And now I'm going to introduce our final speaker, Tim Parton, who is a biological farmer, works by replacing synthetic insects with inputs with brood biology and nutrition, using natural fungicides and predators to grow a healthy and nutritious crop. Tim has won many awards over the years, such as Soil Farmer of the Year in 2017, Sustainable Farmer of the Year in 2019. He has a passion for a healthy ecosystem on farm, to be able to work as one with nature. Already working to do net zero on his farm, Tim is also looking to maintain a healthy living soil for generations to come. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from you now, Tim. Over to you.
Hang on. Thanks, Georgie. Thanks for the intro. Evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to come and to be speaking to you tonight. I'm farm manager at Brood Park Farm, which is in South Staffordshire. We're a 300-hectare farm where, as Georgie said, I try to farm as biologically and nutritionally as possible. So I don't use pre-emergent herbicides, I don't use insecticides, I don't use growth regulators, and I don't use fungicides, and I try to use very few herbicides. I have a 50-50 ratio split between winter to spring cropping, so every field on the farm will have a cover crop growing on it at some point in that 12-year period. Cover crops are the real centre and the heart of what I'm doing, always getting that carbon back into the soil, always feeding that biology, and always hopefully moving forward. I grow milling wheats, winter oilseed rape, I grow spring barley for malting, spring beans, spring lupins. Lupins are a fantastic protein source, and it always baffles me why we're not growing more lupins rather than importing soya from all the way around the world. It's just ludicrous. But it's always a chicken and egg scenario where the farmers don't want to grow it until there's a good market for them. The mills don't want to buy it until they've got a good supply. So we just keep going on with this ostrich mentality of our heads in the ground and nothing changing. But where I grow lupins, I always do an extra ton to the hectare of wheat. They're just a fantastic soil improver. I've also got grass in the rotation, which is rotated around the farm. So I grow grass for haylage for horses because we're quite close to Wolverhampton. So we've got a good equine market in the area. I also grow cornflowers for seed. I grow corn marigolds for seed. I pretty much will have a go at anything if it's going to improve the soil and there's a good margin there. Profit is always my #1 priority, because without profit, I can't do all the environmental things that I love to do. We are in the mid-tier, so all our waterways are protected, and I've got margins and corridors all around the farm, which in my early years of coming off insecticides were important for getting my predator numbers up. But what I found as time's gone on, the whole farm is just buzzing with life now, and I still keep the mid-tier, but it's not as vital as it was when I first started. Just a bit of a recap of why I started. One of the reasons: soil is so precious. Soil gives us food, it gives us clean water, it gives us air. Without soil, we can't survive on this planet. This is just a slide going back to 2012, where it shows 64 acres of soil lost in 6 days. We can't just go and shovel that back up. It's gone. And we, as farmers and as inhabitants of this planet, we've all got to play our part in keeping that soil and keeping that nutrition where it needs to be, because obviously that soil goes into our estuaries, blocks them up, and it also goes into our oceans, creating dead zones. 70 to 90% of our oxygen comes from marine photosynthesis. We can't keep doing this. We've got to look after the planet in which we live. There is no planet B. This is all we've got. And if everybody demanded their food produced in a regenerative way, we'd have a lot better planet, we'd have a lot healthier food, and we'd all be moving forward for generations to come. You can tell I get quite passionate about this subject. So I've been a regen farmer for probably 14 years now. I use a direct drill, so I'm just popping a seed into the ground. It's a highly modified drill, so I've got a liquid system on there, so I can put biology right in that rhizosphere, right next to seeds, to start to get that synergism going on right from day one. I can also put nutrition down there, and I've got hoppers that I can companion crop. I can broadcast out the back. So I've just adapted the drill to do what I want. I've also got row cleaners on there. I was having a problem, especially following oilseed rape. The combine doesn't spread the chaff that nicely, and I would start to get acidic conditions where that chaff was breaking down, because oilseed rape is such a shallow seed. By putting the row cleaners on, I'm just clearing that little narrow seed trench, so I'm getting good seed to soil contact. And if I'm in chopped straw, again, I'm just moving that chopped straw out the way. People often ask me if I finished modifying the drill. I don't know. I modify the drill to get over problems. I always have this vision, I suppose, for want of a better word, that whatever the problem is, I can think, if I think about it, I can get over the problem. So it's just a matter of just trial and error until I get over a problem, which is why I've modified the drill to the way I have. I've adapted the drill since that picture. I've now got peristaltic pumps on the drill. So the peristaltic pump is basically just like a kidney dialysis machine. So it's a very gentle squeezing action. So it's very kind on the biology I'm putting down into the seed furrow. It can also cope with a very dirty liquid. When I'm brewing now, because I've got better at brewing biology, I get an awful lot of biofilm there, which on a normal diaphragm system was blocking my system up, and I was having to clean the filters all the while, which just wasn't practical. With the peristaltic pumps now, I can really move that forward. I work with a chap called Trevor Tappin that developed that pump for me, and he developed the liquid system for me. I come up with problems, and Trevor comes up with solutions for me. We work really well together. But that has really moved me forward in the way that I can put biology down there and it's not damaged, and I can get all the good stuff that I want to put down into that seed for her. That's one of my brewers. So as I said, I brew up biology. The air that we breathe is 78% nitrogen. Why the hell are we buying nitrogen when we can just use biology to take that nitrogen out of the atmosphere and feed our plants for us and convert it? I also use phosphorus releasing bacteria. Again, there's so much phosphorus in our soil. We just need the right biology to make it available to us. I'll also brew up trichoderma. Trichoderma is a very aggressive fungi, so if there was any fusarium on my seed, the trichoderma would eat it. Biology has got all the answers. It's just we haven't asked the right questions, and I firmly believe that the last century was the chemical century. this century is going to be the biological century, because we just cannot continue to pollute the planet in which we live. When I'm brewing, I've got an air pump there, and you can see a heat pump down at the bottom here. So I heat the water to about 18 degrees. I suddenly had a light bulb moment that I realized when anything's reproducing, it normally likes to be warm. So by heating the water, I get a much better brew now. I'm getting loads of biofilm, and which is why I needed to move to the peristaltic pump. I also make compost on farm. It's my belief that we've been killing all the biology in soil for the last 70, 80 years, and we just need to reintroduce that. So by making my own farm compost, I can then extract it. So I either extract it and brew it up. So I'll put it in a brewer and I brew it up, or I'll make a compost slurry, where I'm just seeing the picture there. I'm just using a drill with a stirrer on the end, so really aggressive to knock all those spores off the organic matter that I can then reintroduce through the drill back into the soil, to keep reintroducing different biology all the while, because we've been killing it for so long. I just want to reintroduce that. So it's a big part of what I do, is making compost and reintroducing all that biology back into the soil. I'll also do a lucerne brew. The reason I'm brewing a lucerne brew, I'm trying to brew protozoa. Protozoa will eat bacteria. Bacteria are about 5:1 carbon to nitrogen ratio, but the protozoa are after the carbon, not the nitrogen. So for every 6 bacteria they'll be eating, they'll spit 5 molecules of nitrogen back out, which is a way again that I can keep reducing the amount of nitrogen I'm using on farm. Nitrogen is our best friend and our worst enemy. We have to have nitrogen in the system to make the system work. But if we get too much, we get weak cell plants, which is where we'll start to get disease coming in. We'll get pests coming in, because those plants just aren't photosynthesizing. They're just blocked up with sugar, and we're going to have a real problem. So I'm just trying to, again, use biology to make that nitrogen available. So I'm not putting a lot of inputs in there. I'm using the best of nature to get the best out of that crop. People will often refer to me as a low input farmer, which I really hate being called that, because what I'm doing, I'm making informed decisions about everything I do. So I call it intelligent farming. I don't mind spending money. When people say that you're a low input farmer, people always have this vision in their head. I find that a farm isn't being farmed to its full potential, and it's not the best crops, and it's just an excuse just to be able to farm that way. What I'm doing is far beyond that. It's using intelligent, informed decisions all the while. So I do an awful lot of sap testing of crops, which is just like a blood test. So I'm all the while seeing what that plant needs and getting that plant to full potential. So I want to spend the least money to get the highest yield out of that crop all the way through the growing period. As I said, I put nutrition down. This is just some of the nutrition I put down for oilseed rape. There's a big problem, as we know, with flea beetle. The only reason that flea beetle is attacking the oilseed rape is because you've got monosaccharides and monofructose, which is just the sugar that flea beetles and aphids love to eat. By giving the plant the right nutrition, that plant will be photosynthesizing. It will convert those sugars into polysaccharides and polyfructose. It will put them out as exudates to feed the biology in the soil. It works on a 24-hour period every time, so that sugar is not being stored. As long as the plant is working properly, flea beetles just fly on by, the same as aphids won't bother with the plant. They'll just move on to a plant that isn't functioning properly. It's always nature's way of taking a poor plant out. It's nature's way of bringing in the bin men and getting rid of the rubbish, because if a plant isn't functioning properly, it's not going to survive in nature, and nature is sending the bin men to take that plant out. I hope that makes sense, but it's just how it works. If you've got a healthy plant, flea beetles and aphids just won't bother it. This is just showing how biology is working. So you can see the slide on the left here is one of my wheat plants, and you can see that riser sheath is covered in soil, which is showing to me that the plant is putting out the sugars. It's the fungi and the bacteria are feeding off that exudates, which is why all this riser sheath is just covered in soil, which it's just showing to me that the whole system is functioning properly. And you can see those glues there. When you get high fungi soils, most of my soils are about 2:1 fungi to bacteria. Once you get that mycorrhizal working, you get all the free goodies, you get all the nutrition probably coming into function for that plant. And that mycorrhizal fungi will produce glues called glomalin. That glomalin will hold nutrition in that glued aggregation form for decades. It's just how nature intended the soil to work, and that's just showing how that's working really well. This is a friend of mine's farm who's in a conventional system, high input system, and you can just see that there's no aggregation there. There's no interaction between the soil. That plant is just on almost like a drug addict situation where all the inputs are being applied and the plant's just sucking them up. It's got no interaction with the soil whatsoever, and that's just showing the real difference between a biological soil and a drug addict soil, for want of a better word. It's just not functioning. That soil isn't. It's a good plant, it looks well, but it's not functioning within the soil. It's not a working soil. It's not a cycling soil. That plant is just dependent on inputs. I grow an awful lot of cover crops in my system. As I said, this is an 11 species cover crop. I'm a founder member of the Green Farm Collective. We're a group of farmers that come together to be farmers for farmers to trade carbon and biodiversity. This is just a picture showing where I've traded some biodiversity. I'm not willing to divulge how much I traded that for, but it is a substantial amount. And the company we're trading with is more interested in looking at biodiversity and seeing the benefits that biodiversity is bringing. And I sell the story to them. And by doing that, it helps me invest more into the farm to be able to do even more. But this was taken in middle of November. It might have even been late November, and you can just see the sunflowers are still going there. And whether you agree with climate change or not, you can't disagree that our temperature is changing and our seasons are changing. When I'm drilling, I always like to keep soil covered, so I'll always drill what we call drilling on the green, and keep doing that. That soil is protected. My infiltration rates of water is normally about 1 inch every 6 minutes, and it will do that no matter how much water I've had, because I've got that carbon sponge there, because my soils are improving and working. It will just keep infiltrating that and keeping the water on the land where I want it, rather than running off into our rivers and streams and causing us flooding. And that it's just always keeping that soil protected is always paramount to me. And by doing that, then I'm not going to get surface compaction from heavy rain. I'm not going to get blow off. It's always covered, always protected, and then quite often that soil won't be throwing up other plants to protect itself, because I've already done the job for it. So that's just drilling into oilseed rape volunteers. You can see the wheat coming through there. In the early years of doing it, it was always a good way to keep the slugs eating the oilseed rape volunteers rather than my wheat. But as you start to go down the cycle and your soil's functioning, the only reason a slug will attack a plant is because the plant is producing a polyamide. That polyamide again is just a neon light, just like the sugars in other plants for aphids to come in, saying, come along, eat me, I'm not functioning properly. And as I've gone through this time of being a regen farmer, I no longer have to use slug pellets. I've got a big pile in my chem store, but I just don't use them because that soil is functioning. The only reason the plant will be producing a polyamide is because there's not enough available potassium, there's not enough available iron, and it will be taking in copper, which produces the polyamide. Excuse me. That's just a picture of some of my wheat where I've got away with using no herbicides at all. It's which is always my goal. I don't want to be putting poisons on the land if I don't have to, but if I do, I'll always try and offset that with encouraging biology to eat any surplus chemical that I put on. That is a crop of wheat from this time. Crop of X days, again with no fungicides, no insecticides, no seed dressings, no growth regulators. So I'm always using nutrition by getting the silicon into the plant. I'm making that cell wall really strong, so that plant has got its armor on from day one, that it can fight off any pest or disease attack. So I'm always using nutrition to keep that plant balanced. And I say I do an awful lot of sap testing to be able to do that. So I'm sap tested every 10 to 14 days, which is just like having a blood test, so I can see any deficiencies coming into that plant and I can react before they actually appear in the plant, which is paramount for what I'm trying to do. I also use a lot of natural biology that I brew up. So I brew up Bacillus subtilis and I brew up Bacillus amyliquefascium. The amyliquefascium is like the stronger cousin of the Bacillus subtilis. So if the Bacillus subtilis can't cope, the amyliquefascium will come in. And you can see from the slide here where there's lots of brown rust coming into a crop of Crusoe wheat. That was untreated. Where I've treated with the biology, you can see it's clean and it's a healthy growing plant. You know, if I hadn't have treated that year, that would have cost me probably a ton, 2 tons to the hectare. To brew up biology normally costs me about £2.50 per hectare. I could do it cheaper, but I just think I'm being a bit too tight then. So it works really well. It also works really well on fusarium. Where I treated for fusarium, I got 2%. Where I was untreated, I'd got 36% fusarium. So straight away, I'm taking that fusarium out of the system. I'm not cycling it and growing it in my next crop, because I'll always home save seed. By home save seeding, you've got endophytes on that seed, so it's already being adapted to go back into your land, into your environment, and using epigenetics. I believe that plant is moving forward, so it'll be a better plant than what I've just grown. That is the field of wheat that I had in the slide there. That averaged 2 tonne to the hectare. It probably did more because it was doing 13.5 in a lot of places. That was from 50 kilos of soil applied in, and then monitoring just to top up with foliar in. Foliar in are 5 times more efficient than soil applied, probably 95% available. So I'm not polluting the environment. I'm not having all that nitrogen running off into my waterways, which I wouldn't have as much as a conventional farmer, because I've got more carbon in my soil. I've got good aggregation. But it's always just keeping that nitrogen balance. Nitrogen's our best friend and our worst enemy, all rolled into one. If it's, you know, nitrogen came in after the Second World War. We had all these ammunition places, and the nitrogen came in, and I can see why farmers would have loved it. Yields went through the roof. But for every spare kilo of nitrogen in the system, you're burning 100 kilos of carbon out of that system, and that can't continue. We cannot continue to do that. Carbon is everything. There's a really good book by David Montgomery called Dirt. I'd recommend everybody to read that, because in that book it tells how every society in the world's history has failed because they didn't look after their soil. The Roman army had to disband because they couldn't feed the soldiers, and it takes a long time for that process to happen, normally over a 100-year period. So the first generation that had fantastic soil can't tell that third generation how bad the soil's gone. And I believe, you know, it's changing now, but I believe we were on that exact same journey. But thankfully, light bulbs are coming on, and people are starting to realise that we do have to look after the soil in which what we've got on this planet. That's a crop of Planet Spring barley, 20 kilos of soil applied in, 18 kilos of foliar. That was my best crop that year. It's pretty much standard practice for me now, right across the board with barley, to farm in this way. I also trap moths for Rothamsted. I just like to see what's going on the farm. I think we've got about 320 different species that we've recorded on farm, and I've got numbers equivalent to a woodland situation, which they've never seen before, but not in an arable situation. And they just tell me, you know, we don't know what you're doing, Tim, but just keep doing it, because this is incredible. And the moth numbers I catch, it's just through the roof. But the reason I get excited about the moth numbers is if you've got the food source there, as in moths, as in caterpillars, then obviously the bird numbers increase, because I've got that food source there. I work closely with a bird ringing group who come out with a thermal imager at night, so as we can spot where the birds are, and then we can ring and have a bit of an idea of numbers. We've got a lovely woodcock there that they go out at night with. And one of the other beautiful things that we did the one night, we got somebody from a mammal expert out with us, and they just looked through the thermal imager, and they found a harvest mouse, which they netted and caught. And we put a picture out on Twitter. The Mammal Society got in touch with us and said there are no harvest mice in South Staffordshire, and it just happened we got an expert with us that confirmed that it was a harvest mice. They gave us a few extra pairs, and my son bred those up over the summer. So we increased the gene pool. We put those harvest mice out there, which was just fantastic. They're just a lovely little mouse, and it was just wonderful to see them. But we're not disturbing the soil and not disturbing the environment, because I'm direct drilling. That's why everything is just coming back, because I'm farming in harmony with nature. I always use the analogy, it's merrily down the stream. Life is but a dream. If you're going with nature, life is easy. You start paddling upstream, life becomes very difficult, and nature is always going to win. It's the arrogance of us as human beings that it took millions and millions of years to create the earth. We've only been here for a fraction of the time, and it's like, we'll take it from now. We know what we're doing, and we didn't know what we're doing, and it's nobody's fault, but it's time to rectify the damage that's been done. And it's every inhabitant of this planet's job to do their bit, be it by demanding farm produced in a regenerative way, or planting a tree, or doing something, but it's everybody's responsibility in my mind. that's just a look at numbers that have been caught at Brood Park Farm. A lot of red data species there, but that's only a tiny little glimpse into what's happening here. And I always call it's the best restaurant in town, because everything is flooding back. We've successfully had a kestrels bred over the years. There was 14 chicks of kestrels being bred on farm. We've got Barnsley breeding on farm. Everything is coming back because the food source is here. And it's just wonderful to see, to be crop walking and see skylarks going up galore, to see yellow hammers, to see linnets back on farm. It's just beautiful. I'm yet to meet an unhappy regen farmer, unless they were just born bloody miserable, because there is nothing not to like. We're making more money. We've got more ecosystem where everything is working on farm. So the whole farm is alive and vibrant, and it's just fantastic to be walking around.
Tim?
Yeah.
I'm really sorry to stop you now. You're talking about the birds as well, which just seems wrong. But could you finish up in soon? We've got so many good questions coming through.
I'm very, very close. For
Brill,
2 minutes and I'm done. This was probably my greatest catch, for want of a better word, of last year, which is a lesser spotted woodpecker. They're really, really shy and very rare, and we've got them breeding on farm now, which is absolutely fantastic for me. And that is the end of my presentation, which is healthy soil, healthy food, healthy people, healthy planet. Thank you.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much, Tim. That really was a whirlwind. We're just starting to look at these biological systems in more detail, and it seems crazy that us as farmers, we haven't looked at soil in that kind of detail and with that knowledge for such a long time. Just to see what you're doing, it's a whole new way of farming, and you're putting a lot of effort in, but as you said, it's working with nature, which is really key, and great to see all those species that are thriving, sort of auxiliary to all of the crops that are looking so healthy. And for those who aren't too sure, those putting that small amount of nitrogen on, and how little pesticides you're using, but how healthy and clean those crops are, that is quite something. So now I'm going to move on. We've got a flurry of questions that have come in. Thank you. If all the speakers could come and join us now for the panel session. Sophie has been carefully monitoring all of these questions, and I will do my best to chair and make sure that we can get through as many of them as possible.
Great, thank you. I actually thought probably a good one to start with, and probably good for all the speakers to answer while we're at the start and have got time, is if everyone could maybe say about where people can find more resources on all of your talks, for obviously all inspirational, where they can go to get more information.
So if we hand around just very quickly as well, we'll endeavour to get we will get a YouTube link on this. So if any of the speakers want to send me links, I can put them in on the YouTube as well. But if we go around, start off Kelly, Sarah, then Tim.
Okay, well, mine's pretty easy. If you search for Rothamsted Research and look at the YouTube channel, I've got an entire playlist of carabid resources, a little bit of information on how to trap and generally why I'm doing what I'm doing. I'm also very active on Twitter if farmers want to get in touch with me on there, or just get in touch with our comms team at Rothamsted.
Well, thank you.
Yes, so we've got lots of resources online as well on our People's Trust for Endangered Species website. I can send the links to Georgie, as she said, to put on the YouTube site. Something worth mentioning as well is the Hedge Hub site that's been produced now through HedgeLink. So that's got loads of hedgerow resources, everything from management to why they're great for wildlife to research papers. So it's a really useful resource to look at in terms of hedgerow management. And on the PTES website, we've also got various leaflets that can be downloaded, looking at hedge species ID, also hedgerow management, and so on. So lots of different stuff in different places. I can send the links to all of them.
Well, thank you.
I've done lots and lots of podcasts, which are all available online on Parker419 on Twitter, which I do Twitter a bit. So yeah, there's lots out there. If you just search me, it's all there.
Well, thank you. Online's the place to be, which I guess if you're all on Zoom, that should be easy to access as well. Next question, please, Sophie.
Yep. So this says, Tim Georgie, do you wish your farms to become organic in the future? What yields are you currently getting, if you've got a few examples? And if you were organic tomorrow or organic in 10 years' time, would that be different?
Tim, I'll hand over to you first.
Yields for me, I've never had a yield drop. My yields keep going up. It's understanding the system and making sure your soil's ready for direct drilling. So a normal average for me would be 10 tonne to the hectare. We broke the record this time with 12 tonne to the hectare. But yields are just continually rising. Do I want to be organic? I set out to be no-till organic, and organic still appeals to me. But because I've got such a biological soil now, if I do have to use a chemical, which is only herbicides these days for me, I'll always, so if I'm using Roundup, I'll always use fulvic acid, so I can straight away reduce the amount of glyphosate I'm using. I'll always use some citric acid, so again I can reduce the amount of glyphosate. But I'll always put a bit of molasses in there to stimulate the biology. And then what we found by doing tests, by stimulating that biology, any spare glyphosate that's hit the soil, the biology will just eat that glyphosate up, and it's not running off in our waterways. So it's not a high priority for me to be organic, because I think the way I'm farming is I'm proved that everything is coming back to the farm. If I can achieve it, great. If I don't, I'm not too worried, because the whole thing is living here at the moment anyway. So I couldn't get it much better if I went organic, I don't believe.
Well, that's great. I'll be very brief with mine. So when we set out, Hope Farm decided not to be organic so we could remain as relevant to as many farmers as possible in the demonstration work we're doing. Biodiversity is thriving on the farm whilst we're not organic. We're moving towards regenerative practices, taking out insecticides and fungicides are the next thing, and herbicides to try and reduce or minimize use there, and trying to learn from people like Tim on how to do that. We, at the moment, if we went to organic, we would be reducing our yields, although the certification means that we'd get paid for it. So it would be a good business idea. But we want to try and see how far along we can get on that journey to working with nature, but maintaining those high yields as well. And our wheat's between sort of 8 and 10 tonnes a hectare. Our spring crops hit a dip when we tried to go to direct drilling without where the soil wasn't in good enough condition for it, so we had to rein back and slowly going back in now, and the yields are looking much better for it.
Great, thank you. Another one is, do carabids hunt by sight? If so, perhaps it's not surprising they're more abundant within crops where there's less dense vegetation at the surface rather than in margins.
I think you know where that question's going, Kelly.
Well, actually, carabids, although there's a lot of species specifics within it, there are some carabids that do hunt by sight. Mostly they hunt by smell. So as soon as I move Megan around, you'll see that her antenna move and she's smelling what's going on rather than looking what's going on. So, and then she's also got her palps there. She'll run across the floor and smell for the snail trails. That's how she knows to hunt her prey. So it is mostly on smell rather than sight. But some carabids are particularly of open areas, and the most abundant ones in farmland are those ones of open field environments, because they can exploit the resources better and they're moving around at the surface more. So the bias in pitfall trapping is for things that run around on the surface, and we catch that species the most. So there is also a kind of trap bias in that. So.
Real, thank you for that, Kelly. That's really interesting. Next question, please, Sophie.
Yeah. Oh, there's so many. Someone's asking, Tim, are you heading to Groundswell? Now you share
hopefully
knowledge.
Hopefully, I've spoken at Groundswell many times, so I'm sure I'll be about there. Yeah.
Someone's also asked him, did you mention what soil type you were on?
Sandy loam and clay loam.
Okay, next one. This is inspirational. With rising farm input prices for fertilizers, fuel, pesticides, etc., surely creating a circular, resilient, sustainable farming cycle can be shown to be the economically better perspective, never mind the nature regeneration benefits as well.
Is that a question or a statement? I mean, it's a great statement.
Yeah.
Well, it has a question mark. I suppose, does it stack up economically? Can it be shown that it is the better economical choice?
Right. Okay. I think there's growing evidence based off that. I think, Tim, yours is as good as any to show the benefits are.
If you noticed on the one slide I showed with the wheat, the production cost was £82 a tonne. I'd sold that wheat forward at £280 a tonne. It had averaged 12 tonne to the hectare, so it's quite easy to do the math.
Yeah, that works quite well. And we're also at Hope Farm, we operate with an open book, so have shown that although we've taken out this 10% of the farm is dedicated, or over 10% is dedicated to conservation habitats, the income from the cropping has remained stable. So that's, yeah, although you get fluctuations year on year with weather and markets and stuff, it's important to make sure that we can make a profit from the system.
Great, thank you. Okay, so one that can probably go to everyone that's spoken about different things is, how can these things be fed into policy? Dialing in from Scotland, and would love to support Scottish farming with this insight.
I'm going to start off sending that question over to Sarah.
Yeah, sure. So as an organisation, People's Trust for Endangered Species, we're part of a group called HedgeLink, which is essentially an umbrella group that brings together, all organisations interested in hedgerow management, and through that we're feeding messages on to DEFRA and Natural England, for example, as the new elm scheme is being developed and so on. So that's one mechanism that we use to feed information into policies being developed. So if you've got any thoughts, we're always keen to hear them. We can always share them as well.
So Sarah, I'm just going to bot that back to you. How well do you think policies are doing at the moment in informing your exemplar hedgerow management that you've described this evening? Yeah,
well, I mean, that's still a very open-ended question in terms of what form different schemes are going to take. I wish I had more sort of definitive answers to give linked to that, but the feeling I believe is that DEFRA's aware that we need to sort of do some element of looking at hedgerow health to then make decisions based on what needs to be done next. So at the moment, hopefully it's still heading in that direction, but I don't have any definitive answers as to sort of what the final scheme is going to look like yet.
No, yeah, so true. As with the whole farm system, I think it's about getting farmers to look at what's there and helping that to determine the management. Mm-hmm. Right, I'm going to head over to Kelly now, and then we'll get to Tim afterwards as well.
Okay, so I contribute to evidence consultations whenever I can for DEFRA, just with my scientific opinion. But also I will say that the new environmental land management schemes, whilst there isn't a lot of how it's actually going to be applied on the ground, they are making a lot of nice noises at the moment, particularly when it comes to beneficial invertebrates. One of my big bugbears, if you'll excuse the pun, with the old schemes was that beetle banks were only mentioned as being useful for wild birds as food resources, not that they actually provided beneficial pest control in beetles. So, but that is more of a thing in the schemes now, that they are explained that these beneficial invertebrates can help crop productivity. So what I would like to see is the kind of monitoring that informs when those margins and when those interventions are doing what they should. So we'll see how that comes about.
No, very true, very true. Tim, have you got any further comment, please?
I do my bit. I was speaking in Westminster yesterday, so we can all gotta keep trying. I speak all around the world. I keep pushing and pushing. Everybody's got a farm this way.
Oh, that's so true. Thank you, everyone. Have we got another question coming through, Sophie?
Yep. So there is one, Tim, you mentioned your friend with the wheat plant without all the biology. Have they shown any interest in starting to move towards your system?
No.
No? What do you think it would take to make them?
Oh, people get scared of change, and you can't rush somebody on the journey. If you've got to wait till that light bulb comes on, and until it comes on, you can't rush them, because I've tried that. You can get people going, but then they get scared and they go back 10 steps, and it's another couple of years before they have another go. It's the only way you can get people is to keep educating and keep showing that there's a better way. The chemical way has gone. It's falling apart. We all know that. We're losing chemicals. Chemicals aren't working. The system's dying, and people have got to realise that there isn't a chemical answer. It's got to be a biological.
Yeah. No, that's so true. I think there's some farmers out there, including yourself, who are doing amazing things out there. And then if you take a step into some farms which perhaps aren't, you kind of want to shake the place up, don't you? And think, okay, well, this needs to be alive. This soil should be buzzing with life, and there should be things. Winter farmland, it should be an exciting place. It shouldn't just be some tiny wheat plants that are struggling to survive through puddles in the field. It should be full of worms and everything else working away, and winter farmland birds in huge flocks above the ground.
You go through phases when you first start, and it works. You tell everybody, but nobody listens, and you get really angry because nobody's listening. But then you come out the other side and you just help the people that are ready.
Yeah, no, very true, very true. Well, another question, please, Sophie.
Yeah, so there is another one that says, sometimes agronomists are still very stuck in chemical farming. How do we change this group of professional advisors?
I have opinions on that, but I'm going to open it to the floor in case anybody else has something to say first. Tim, you look like you wanted to say something there.
It's one that comes up very, very regular, and my advice to anybody wanting this journey, and quite often when I give a talk, somebody would always come at the end and still do and say, Tim, I love what you're doing, but my agronomist says it won't work on my farm. And I always say the same, well, change your agronomist then. And he said, I can't do that. He or she is a family friend. Well, it's your business, and you've got to become the farmer again. And I get slated for saying this, but chemical agronomists have got really good at connecting with the farmer. They tell the farmer what to drill, what to sow, what to put on it, when to harvest it, what to spend on it. Who's the farmer? It's the farmer has got to become the farmer again. And if the agronomist isn't with you, you've got to change your agronomist. It's your business, and you've got to grow a pair, for want of a better word, to have the balls to get out there and become the owner of your business again, and farm in a way that you want to do it. Because once the light comes on, it won't go away. It just keeps nibbling at you until you actually do it. And if you haven't got the right, it's just advice that you're paying for. If you haven't got the right agronomist, then you've got to change. It's as simple as that. It's your business.
Yeah, that's so true. Kelly and Sarah, have you got anything to come in on? I see you're unmuted, Kelly.
Yes, I've noticed that there is a kind of cry out for agronomists wanting information from current science, and it's sometimes a bit hard for them to get that information because of the way that we publish our papers, that they don't have access to that. So I do get a lot of interest myself. So I've produced a carabid ID guide, and a lot of agronomists have approached me for copies of that. So it's kind of keeping those connections to keep them informed of what the current science is saying about these kind of practices as well. We need to keep talking to each other and giving them those resources that aren't just biased towards what they can get a hold of.
Yeah, so true. Sarah, have you got anything to add?
Well, just the same as Kelly, really. I think the communication and trying to get, messages across to different groups of people is so important.
No, 100%. And I think we've got to be really careful with agronomists as well. I know our conservation organisations have been accused of farmer bashing in the past, and we should make sure we're not agronomist bashing as well, because at the end of the day, they've got the information that they're given, and they've got customers to please, and they've got liabilities to watch out for. And they could have huge claims put against them if they don't advise for a chemical and then a crop falls flat on its face. But if we could,
which is why it's got to come from the farmer, Georgie. It can't be put on the agronomist, because the agronomist has got to defend himself. He takes that insurance policy, which is why it's got to be the farmer making these choices, not the agronomist. It's not fair to put it on an agronomist.
No,
and there's some brilliant agronomists out there. There really is some brilliant ones out there now, and everybody's taking it on board, and everybody will have to. But you can't just put it all on the agronomist. It's got to be the farmer led.
And that knowledge exchange for agronomists to be able to access this information is so critical. I know agronomists are reminded all the time now about soil health and IPM, but we have to have a nitrogen management plan under our legislation we work through with our agronomist. Same with our manure management plan. Why don't we have a beneficial management plan? And all of those things, and think about it in so much detail, so that it was looking at the whole system in a much more holistic way. I think if we moved along that way and had that training available, it would be much easier to move forward. But things are changing, so hopefully it's in that direction.
Fab. So there isn't any more questions, but hang on.
I think there's some more. We've got we will finish promptly on 8.
Can we get a media farmer on board with these ideas? Okay, just one more. Can we get a media farmer on board with these ideas to get it to a wider audience? Someone like Jeremy Clarkson, who seems to have done more for the understanding of the challenges of modern farming than most other programs, just due to his reach.
I love that media farmer. There's some amazing farmers who are great on talking about what they're doing, and sometimes I worry, like people like yourself, Tim, that we over rely on hearing from you, and you must struggle to find the time to farm. But it's so important for farmers to share what they're doing. I've got Tim and Kelly. You're both. I'm using unmuted as a means of wanting to say something. No, Kelly's shaking her head. Tim, over to you then.
I think people like Jeremy Clarkson, it would be great to get them on board, but they need to sell the program, don't they? And he's always going to pick faults to sell the program, and unless the light bulbs come on, he's not going to do it. He's done brilliant, I think, for farming, and he could do a lot more. And if he embraced this, I know he's embracing some of it, because I hear through other farmers, so he is embracing. He's looking at it, and every little bit helps. Change never comes from big organisations; it always comes from individuals, and we've all just got to get behind it and demand food produced in this way, because it's far more nutrient dense. It's no coincidence to me that the rate of chemicals going up, human health has gone down, and it's time to readdress that.
Yeah, that's so true. Don't get me started on issues on food and health issues and all that. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for that. I think on that note, we might wrap up on the questions. I will just go around to each speaker really quickly, finishing at 8 o'clock, so less than a minute each. If we start in speaker order, Sarah, Kelly and Tim, if you had any final words. If not, then don't worry, don't feel pressured to.
Yeah, no, just thank you. It's been, listening to our talks has been really inspirational as well, and I've learned a lot and really enjoyed it. And yes, please get in touch if anyone's got any questions linked to hedgerow management as well.
Yeah, Kelly, over to you.
Thanks for inviting me. No, I've really enjoyed it. Megan's enjoyed it too, and very inspiring talks from both Sarah and Tim. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, this is our first carabid beetle we've had on our webinars, so it's taken 3 years. Tim, last from you, please.
I suppose any advice is just don't be scared. Start and have a go. Don't push yourself too far. But there's loads of people doing it now. There's loads of people to help you. It's one thing with regen farmers. We always help each other, and it's quite refreshing to be amongst farmers like that. But everybody's got to do it. That's all I'd say. Everybody has got to start the farm this way. We have no planet B. This is all we've got, and we've got to look after it.
Yeah. Oh, brilliant. Thank you, Tim. And I'm very sorry, Sophie, I didn't properly introduce you. Sophie is our assistant farm manager and has been our carbon farming manager until very recently on the farm as well. So thank you so much for your help. Thank you to Lisa and Hayley behind the scenes from the events team who've helped keep all of these cogs working. And to our three speakers, I feel like I need to press a download button somewhere. We endeavour to get this video in the next few weeks up on our Farm Wildlife YouTube channel, which is also where we have the webinars from last year and year before that. And we will try and get this information in an easy place for you to access on our farming blogs on RSPB website as well. So thanks so much for everybody who stayed with us right to the end. Lots of you still with us, so it sounds like you've enjoyed it. And good night.
Bye all.